Tales of Ravenore, the Iron Witch, by Frank J. Zunka. Chapter 1. The Stray Forest. All she could hear was the sound of her own labored breathing as she ran for her life. The teenage girl had no idea what she was running from, but she couldn't press her legs to move any faster, and yet she tried. Her heart pounded like it was about to explode in her chest. Tears ran down her face. She had never been so scared, at least not that she could recall at this moment of sheer terror. Why couldn't she see? All around her was dark mist. Her hands lurched in front of her, attempting to grip something, anything. But there was nothing before her but more dark mist. It burned at her throat and invaded her nostrils like smoke from a fire. It began to choke her. There had to be an end to this. The mist could not continue forever. Or was she already dead? Was this the afterlife? Had she been doomed to endless agony? Soggy ground crunched underfoot. Her damp shoes made squishing noises as she ran. All the energy had been sucked from her body. She had no idea how she continued to move. Gagging on a mixture of tears and mist, her body finally gave out. She collapsed onto the muddy soil, her hands sinking into it and oozing between her fingers. How long had she been running? She had no idea. She had no idea about anything. Even her name and location were a mystery. With pure will, she pushed herself into a kneeling position, and then she saw it, the semblance of light beyond the veil of mist. Renewed hope gave her the energy to rise once more. Her feet sank further into the mud, making it even harder to propel herself onward. Each strenuous step brought her closer to that light, until she was practically crawling toward it. Her hand reached out, groping with a prayer on her lips. A prayer that was answered. Warmth touched her mud-laden skin. Diving forward afforded half her body the freedom from the wall of mist. Lying on her back, she looked up at the sky, which was gray with clouds. She didn't care how overcast it was. The only thing that mattered was that she was free. Her lungs soaked up the clean air, and a smile graced her lips. The small amount of facial movement caused her to wince. Her cheek was suddenly on fire. A touch brought further pain and the realization that she was bleeding, heavily from a wound that could be described as a deep gash. All she wanted to do was lay here and sleep in the mud. Exhaustion lulled her. The beating of her heart slowed until it was close to normalcy. There were too many questions. She forced herself to stand. With a series of aches and deep breaths, she rose to her full height and hobbled over to a nearby tree to help her maintain her footing. Though the aches were coming from her legs, a sharp pain was shooting from her ankle. She hadn't noticed it until now. The adrenaline had likely kept her going, turning her pain receptors off completely. Looking down at her tattered dress, it did not take the wisdom of a healer to see that her ankle was gravely wounded. It was red and swollen. Somehow, after seeing it, the pain seemed to grow worse than a moment prior. Testing her weight on it caused a bolt of lightning to shoot up her leg. Groaning, she pivoted her head to take in her surroundings. There were trees in all directions. Some had odd, gangly shapes, while others had violet and amber leaves. The clouds above her shifted through the foliage. For a moment, the sun peeked out, causing her to cover her eyes. It disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, as if greeting her on its way to an important event. Who am I? She found herself thinking. Muddy fingers gripped her equally muddy hair. It was long and raven black, with parts matted by drying blood. Wiping her hands on the tatters of cloth that was once a blue dress with gold embroidery, she dipped her fingers into the tiny pockets. One came away with a slip of parchment. Wiping the tears from her eyes, she attempted to make sense of the smeared words. It was as if someone had purposely not wanted to see what was written before even the ink dried. Looking down at her hands, she expected to see black ink stains beneath the mud, but it was not so. Turning her attention back to the parchment, she was able to make out a single word, or perhaps a portion of one. There was no way to be certain. The word was Threa. Could that be her name? For now, that's all she had, and she needed something to hold on to, anything to give her some kind of identity. Folding the parchment, she replaced it in her pocket. Again, her eyes swiveled between the trees. Which way was she to go? That was the ultimate question. Being lost in a forest was bad enough without being lost in a forest at night. There would be animals searching for food, and she was easy prey with the smell of blood wafting from her. The beat of her heart quickened once more now that she realized the direness of her plight. Before her, shifting but remaining contained, was the wall of mist. It was preternatural, the way it ebbed and flowed, but seemed imprisoned behind a wall of glass. Going back through was not her first choice. Shrugging, she began her journey by moving away from the mist wall. The further, the better, as far as Threa was concerned. She liked the name. Repeating it in her mind kept her from focusing on the shooting pain in both her ankle and the gash on her cheek. Threa hadn't made it more than 24 steps when a sharp pain blasted through her skull. She held her head, massaging her temples as it dwindled to a low buzzing noise. It really wasn't a noise at all, since she was the only one who could hear it. Purring in her mind, what else could possibly inflict her? Dragging her wounded ankle behind, Threa continued on, using one tree and then the next as a crutch. A noise, and not one in her mind this time. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her ears pricked, scanning for the source. A snapping branch. Taking a deep breath, she hobbled away from the noise, but it was already too late. A monstrous hand tightened around her wrist so intensely that she thought her bones would snap. A wail escaped her, echoing through the forest.
"Shut her up, you fool!" a gravelly voice demanded. "Do you want every human in earshot coming to investigate?"
The hand yanked, spinning her around to face it. She hadn't wanted to see it, and yet now was close enough to feel its foul breath upon her face. The creature's skin was cerulean blue, its eyes pure obsidian, and the war paint that streaked its face was blood red. The large teeth that filled its considerable mouth were tipped with steel, and Threa could see each and every one as its jaw dropped in rage. Wisps of her hair flew away from her face as the creature huffed a restrained roar. Apparently its partner's words had gotten through, and it attempted to be quiet, despite its desire to bellow to the heavens in frustration. Threa remained wide-eyed. She had no idea what to do, or even what her options were. Beneath her, Threa's legs pumped until she realized that there was a fair amount of air between her soles and the ground. The creature had lifted her with a single clawed hand as if she weighed no more than a twig from one of the nearby trees. Once again her heart galloped in her chest. Had she braved the dark mist only to be slain by a monster on the other side? The creature pulled back its free claw, and then it sailed toward her, hitting her squarely in the jaw. It was like an iron ball launching from a trebuchet that hit her squarely in the head. Control over the movement of her body was lost to her, and the world spun before her blinking eyes. Then it was the ground that hit her, forcing the air from her lungs. Her chest heaved, causing her to expel a wheezing sound.
"Now look what you've done," she heard one say. Everything was a blur. "Pick her up and let's go."
The sensation of floating overwhelmed her, and then her stomach landed hard on something, forcing more air from the lungs she had just filled. Like a doll, she was carried over the creature's shoulder, her arm swaying uselessly against its muscled back. She suddenly felt a chill. The temperature had changed several degrees, and she heard the sound of snow crunching beneath the creature's feet. It was here that they decided to stop, and she was dropped onto the ground like a slab of meat. The cold of the thawing snow shocked her back into full awareness, but she didn't dare move. It wasn't difficult to pretend she was unconscious, as every movement brought on a strike of pain. There was no way to discern what the creatures were doing, since her back was to them. However, the stench that filled her nostrils was unmistakable. Smoke.
"What do you think you're doing?"
the first creature asked, as if he found its partner's actions incredulous.
"Making dinner?"
The second responded as if the answer was obvious.
"I know you hungry too."
The creature's language was broken. Grammar was not something it cared to learn. As if speaking to a child, its partner's voice took on an authoritative tone. "This one you cannot eat. Do you feel the magic inside? We take her to the Iron Witch. Then we feast."
"No, we feast now,"
the intense one growled.
"Get another for the witch."
They were either going to eat her or bring her to the witch. Neither sounded too appealing. Disregarding the pain streaking through every part of her body, she rose, took one look over her shoulder to find the creatures still arguing, and took off running. She prayed that they were engaged enough with one another that they wouldn't notice her absence, at least for a few seconds. She needed to get a head start. The trees sped by as she ran in whatever direction would take her as far from them as possible.
Every time she landed on her ankle, her entire leg seized from the torturous agony. The wind caused the gnash in her cheek to sting, and her back ached something fierce. "Force it all from your mind," she repeated to herself in some sort of mantra, but it didn't help. Cracking branches came from behind her. She didn't need to look over her shoulder to know that the cerulean creatures were pursuing her. Their large, hulking forms thudded against the ground with such ferocity that she could feel the vibration beneath her. From the increasing intensity, she could tell that they were not only gaining, but only several steps behind. A horrific growl reinforced their position. Threa had never been more terrified in her life, not that she could recall anyway. Fear gripped her body and her mind. She let out a scream. One of the creatures called out to her, but she couldn't make out words. All she could imagine was a blue-clawed hand reaching out to grab her, and once it did, her life would be over. Dodging to the right, she headed for a tree with a low-hanging branch. Positioning her hand, she ran just underneath and gripped it with every bit of energy she could muster. The bark cut at her palms, but she refused to let go. It bent back until she felt it fighting against her. Then she released it, allowing it to snap back into place and hitting the creature in the process. Sounds of leaves rustling mixed with a whipping noise, followed by a thwack and a roar of anguish. Chancing a glance over her shoulder, she could see they had stopped while one massaged its wounded face. A roar of anger followed, and the vibrations began once again. There would be no escape for her. Besides the striking pain, her chest was heaving. Threa would be unable to maintain this speed much longer. She didn't want to die, not like this, not in a strange land pursued by monsters. Then it finally happened. Her legs gave out. She had made it into a clearing, but there was no sign of a town or a village anywhere in sight. Turning over, she pushed backward on her buttocks, attempting futilely to put some distance between herself and her would-be murderers. "Please!" was all that would emit from her lips. Helplessness and hopelessness overwhelmed her senses, and she raised her arms defensively, knowing full well that the battle axes they bore would slice through her flesh without an ounce of effort. A final roar echoed as it raised the axe. Black blood leaked from its nose where the branch had struck it. The creature's partner didn't attempt to stop it from taking its revenge. She had no ally here. She was alone and would die as such, without even knowing her true name or origins. The axe began its fatal arc downward. Threa shut her eyes and held her breath in anticipation of the end. It did not come, however. Instead, she heard a whoosh of sizzling air fly above her, followed by a whimper of surprise from the creature. She opened her eyes to see a dagger of glowing indigo protruding from the creature's chest. It looked down quizzically as if baffled by the weapon. When he pulled it out, the dagger dissipated into nothingness. "I make a better quarry for your mistress, Grawl," an authoritative voice said from behind Threa. "If you can best me." Threa's head pivoted to see a man in his 50s, far fitter than a man his age had a right to be. Charging up the shallow hill, his speed could not be matched by a teenage girl who was panting in an effort to keep up. Her face was flushed with exertion, but she did not stop to rest. As the man leaped over Threa to engage the creatures he had termed the Growl, the girl immediately came to Threa's aid. Still panting, she helped Threa to her feet and assisted her down the hill. Threa glanced over her shoulder to see the man conjuring weapons from the ether by maneuvering his hands and arms in a variety of patterns. After wounding one with a weapon, it disappeared only to be replaced by another. The man moved with such grace and fluidity that the battle seemed to be more of a dance from her perspective. Placing himself between them, they had difficulty hitting him without injuring each other. They swung, but it was as if he knew their trajectory before the Growl did. Either that or he was making slight alterations to their movements with the magic he so deftly manipulated. Threa was awestruck by the performance. The man made it look so effortless. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. Threa wished she could learn to control her fear the way he did. Moments later, the man stopped moving. Both Growl were slack-jawed, and their eyes rolled back into their head. Crashing to their knees, they fell to the ground. The various blades that had been inserted into their bodies were dispelled, leaving only their inky blood pouring from the open wounds. He stopped them not with a single blow, but dozens, until they were too weak to fight due to excessive blood loss. The man bowed to them, acknowledging their valiant, though futile efforts. The battle had been over before it had begun. Straightening his tunic, he marched over to her. He did not even seem to be winded by the tremendous amount of exertion she'd witnessed. When he approached, she wanted to show him nothing but gratitude for saving her life, but he was the first to speak. "Now, little one, who are you?"
I don't know. I can't remember. I can't remember anything, Threa stammered.
He and the girl exchanged knowing glances. She was unsure what she had said to cause the wordless communication between them, but still she remained silent. He nodded, and his dark, aged eyes narrowed as he observed the cut on her cheek and the way she kept her weight off of her left leg.
I see that you've had a rough day thus far.
That is certainly a mild understatement, sir, she replied.
Come, let us help you. We'll take you somewhere safe.
Threa did feel safe, though she knew nothing about them. They were strangers, who had come to her aid when she needed it most. What else was there to know? The girl gave her a warm smile, and Threa nodded. Perhaps her luck was changing. New friends are what she required more than anything else at the moment. A bath, bandages, and some food wouldn't hurt either.
This is author and award-winning screenwriter Frank Zanka. I hope you've enjoyed the first chapter of the Tales of Ravenore, the Iron Witch. You're sure to get lost within all the facets of the world. The majestic and hazardous lands of Vandara, Direlore, Nasarain, Dionysus, and Spiretop are just a page turn away, as is the magical creatures and villains that bring Threa and her friends high adventure. Check out the Kickstarter page by clicking the link in the description below.